My name is Zihao Wong, and I'm an artist, designer, researcher, and educator. And a lot of my work covers environmental issues, largely related to Singapore's coastal landscape. Particularly, my interest lies on the intertidal coast. I founded the art, design, research practice Superlative Futures. It is a practice that is interested in environmental issues, largely climate change and the rising sea levels in relation to island cities and coastal cities worldwide. Our interest is to use art and design making to bring issues which are largely scientific and technological concerns to the public and enabling a kind of public imagination around these issues so that what we think of is that everyone and all hands are on board because we all live in the same planet that is shared by us and also more than human others who we share this landscape with. This exhibition is called Neglected Topographies and Cosmologies of Care. It is a project that is centered around the idea of representation. And representation means two things. One thing, especially because it comes from my architectural background, is that representation is about drawing and visualizing things. The other aspect of representation is to represent a community or a marginal landscape that cannot speak for itself. And I think that it is also a bit of humans' duty to learn to speak a bit better for the landscapes that need our care and attention. So this exhibition takes the map as its starting point. Particularly, it is the way that the map represents the intertidal coastline, which is the landscape that is becoming quite important, and you see it all over in the news, especially in Singapore where we are dealing with sea level rise and environmental issues. And this is something that I wanted to bring out through this exhibition about matching these stories of the past with the way that we are dealing with the coast in the future. And one of the outcomes of it is that the idea of mapping has been taken out of the cartographic map and is brought into a more creative and artistic endeavor towards mapping. It is about mapping stories together with landscapes and able to tell interesting myths about the place. It is about creating a culture for a landscape that is being reconstructed at this moment by science and technology. This exhibition includes material that started in 2019 when I was doing my doctoral study in architecture at the National University of Singapore. And it was a project that was related to representation of landscapes and sites. So my creative process usually involves looking very much into archival material. Usually that is the starting point for a lot of the thinking that I have. I like to imagine places, especially ones that have sort of are long gone in that sense, right? And I like to imagine how things were when you look at, let's say, the landscape on old maps. And that was one of the first few things that I started looking at, old maps, and thinking about how they differed very much from today's maps, where we know how to draw things and we know how to represent the landscape almost in a way that is well known in that sense, right? Very easily to be understood. I also enjoy researching from archival material that included newspaper articles as well as other older writings that actually complemented the maps in helping me to understand what the older coastal landscape was all about, the older idea of the intertidal coastline. Some of the challenges faced while preparing for this show was that some of the materials were already used in a previous setting, particularly for the doctoral research, and some of the materials have also been shown in the NUS Museum. And then there were new things that were being created for this show. And so the interesting thing was to then ask, how would all of these things come together? So at Art Outreach, I think what happened here was that putting everything down in this space, the things that belong to other exhibitions and the things that belong to new things, belong to like newer collections that were being made. Some of these were actually made because of this exhibition. They allowed me to rethink how the older works could then bond forth newer creations. And that was probably, in that way, a challenge, but also an opportunity, I think, a very, very good opportunity to then realign or reframe the stories of how I used to tell the making processes behind the older works and to put them all together in a new one. So I hope that when people come to this exhibition, they would be able to see how art making can be a way of caring for very fragile landscapes, very neglected ones. And so being able to bring people along this journey of thinking about the landscape together becomes a way to help engage the public into a larger imagination of what the coastline is, and how a large part of it is also to be immersed in not just what is happening in the present and in the future, but to allow people to also enter a very imaginative and rather magical world of the intertidal landscape, and enter this sort of interesting landscape where things are always shifting, things are never still. The landscape shifts from high tide to low tide and back to high tide, and it's really an interesting landscape because it is one that finds it very hard to be represented on the map. And this is a way for people to now realize the beauty of a place that you could only either you go to the real site, or you could enter an exhibition like this and be pulled into the magical wonders of a landscape that never sits still and is always shifting. Okay, on the back wall is a drawing of the whale that was washed up onto the shore of Singapore's Jurong Island. And subsequently, the whale was towed to an area in Topos where for 2 months or slightly more than 2 months, a team of scientists from the Natural History Museum in Singapore were working on the whale to sort of extract the skeleton for part of the Natural History Museum's collection. So environmental crisis, the rising sea levels, and coastal restoration projects are all around us. It's something that we have to face with as a fact now, no longer a kind of a science fiction story that we would think is very far away. It's actually very present and here and now that we have to deal with. I think that design always has been around these issues. What I would think is that design tends to be also partnering very closely with scientific and technological developments, right? So largely, I think that the coastal project is a very much understood by the public as a scientific and technological project to solve climate issues. And I think this is where art becomes either part of the neglected topography, right? Or what I would suggest is that art can become also a partner with science making, in that sense, where art making has its role as cultural making for society. And I think that design can return to one of its sort of neglected roots, which is its allyship with art making. I see my work as a kind of intermediary job of linking up what is usually a scientific discussion to a public audience. And I think that it helps to bring out more than just explanation for a scientific situation. So in that sense, I don't see my work as just trying to illustrate what the sciences are already developing about coastal restoration projects, right? I think that the work has its own avenues of, or at least potentials of creativity, because it is also creating itself through art making, a realm where the public can get engaged about places that are no longer, these are stories of forgotten places, but these are stories of places that will become. The potentials for art making to not just also be presenting issues of science to the public, but to also be producing new knowledges in its own self for the public audience. And I think that a large part of my work also tries to open itself to a bit of public collaboration, to allow the public to come together to tell stories about the coast. Of course, I think this is a cultural project, and I think it is all hands on board, and everybody who can learn to speak a bit better and represent better a landscape at the margins will generally help the landscape going forward in the long run. My work is largely influenced by more generally the intertidal landscape, but actually that's a very specific landscape, especially in Singapore, where a lot of our coastlines have been reconstructed. So the intertidal landscape or the intertidal shoreline is actually a very dwindling landscape that it's very delicate and very few in that sense. And so my project actually builds off what is sort of existing in Singapore's intertidal landscape. So it ranges from my own field trips during my doctoral studies to Tanjong Rimau Coast in Sentosa with the permission of the guides from Sentosa. So you could almost say that all the stories that are sort of fluid and moving along with the waters could be told across places. And I like to think of this as also intertidal thinking, which is how like the intertidal stories can move from places to places and come together in a particular place and form a new story, or sometimes break off and go into another place and form a new story for another place. It was a very good opportunity to be working here at Outreach, particularly the Hearth program, largely because I think that my project also aligns with their vision to support projects that cover social and environmental concerns, and that is quite that aligns very largely with the nature of the art making and the research that I'm interested to do. The program provided a very large space that is also bigger than a typical studio space, so that not just works could be laid out in a different setting. So this is a good place to be working on larger pieces of work, and to allow me to be more bolder and more daring in carrying out the vision of the project. So I think this was a very good outcome of doing that. Also working in the art outreach space opens up your practice to the networks of art outreach, and also what I found was that there were visiting artists, especially very esteemed artists from the Singaporean scene, would visit the place, and actually it became a very strange, or I would say very serendipitous moments of encounter where I would meet people that I have read all about, but also interesting to see the very same people that you read about actually walk through the doors and being able to have a conversation with them about the exact work that was born from all of those thinking. The space was flexible and enough for you to actually rethink things as we were putting things up. So the art making was also in the process of setting up, which was great. One of the outcomes of being able to have that creative autonomy was also for me to continue developing on thinking about what the intertidal was all about. The walkthrough of the space was not necessarily fixed in a particular trajectory, and actually you could have people walking around and mingling with the artwork. Sometimes there was a bit of wall text on this side of the wall, and sometimes there was a bit of art on the other side of the wall, and people actually started to see the relationships between all of this, and that was kind of like how ideas and places would move with the water and make sense sometimes in different places, and the audience became part of the immersive experience of entering the intertidal. So the program offered a micro grant, and that was very helpful also, because as starting or emerging artists, we generally have to raise a bit of fund on our own to support exhibitions like that. So I think it is also very great that they could come alongside and support exhibitions that particularly deal with environmental issues. And I think the micro grant was very useful because it allowed us to produce the larger pieces of work that would be quite costly to produce. And also we produced a art book that is a limited print version of the exhibition that exists then in a book. So the intertidal became a book that was enabled through the micro grant provided by Art Outreach. I think one of the wonderful outcomes of having to exhibit in Art Outreach's Hearth program is that putting your work out in a public setting for emerging artists is always beneficial for artistic work, because you can be working in a studio, but you do need to tap on the networks of art outreach, or to allow the public to come to see your project. Some of the works became the point of discussion for future iterations of it, or future versions of it to happen elsewhere. That there is an interesting line of developments that some of the work shown here will have in 2025 going forward. One of the things that I learned through my own drawing explorations is that perhaps this is a landscape that would not want to be seen by eyes alone, but has to be seen through other ways of seeing. And one of these that I was exploring was that it was a very tactile landscape that was felt through the boots of our feet as we were walking under the rising tides. So you would not really be always seeing the ground, but you would be sensing the ground with the soles of your foot. And so for me, this was a way of then thinking that if the landscape would not be drawn in very traditional ways where it was meant for eyes to see, then how would the landscape be drawn if it was for touching and for feeling with either the soles of your feet or the hulls of a ship? I use a method of drawing with pins, or at least a pointed tool, a pointed needle, to make textures on pieces of paper and draw very speculatively the idea of how would you see the landscape if you were seeing with the soles of your feet. And in another set of work, I asked the question, how would you see, or how would you draw a landscape if you would, this time round, you were the hull of a ship and approaching rocks that were underwater?